Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to our random review. Today's random review comes from the UK, from 1987, and it's Hidden City. This is a relatively new release by BFI, written and directed by Stephen Polyakov, starring Charles Dance. It also stars Cassie Stewart, Bill Patterson, Richard E. Grant, and again BFI. It's a nice booklet. This is a film that I will be upfront about, as far as it's not completely successful. It has flaws, but very much like the subject matter, it is worth kind of sifting through the debris, the decidua, the minutiae of the film, and you should get something interesting out of it. I mean, there is a quote by Alexander Walker of the Evening Standard in the front cover that says, "Holds one spellbound." Now, Alexander Walker isn't my favourite critic in the world. Granted, he's no longer with us, because he was the one that kind of led the Cronenberg crash, almost campaign, because he called it was beyond the bounds of depravity, which is obviously nonsense. So it held Alexander Walker spellbound, if that entices you. But as I say, it is flawed, but it's like a British 80s shaggy dog story. But so this is more about the complete release rather than perhaps the film itself. As I said, made in 1987. I didn't really hear anything about it at the time. You know, there's things like Bellman and True, which I remember at the time, which Indicator released, which is a wonderful little gem. But I don't really remember hearing much about Hidden City. So Charles Dance, an imperious form as he always is, as a writer. The film opens with him in some form of educational establishment in a lecture theatre full of children, and they all have television screens in front of them, and it's supposed to be a film about King Edward's abdication, but it's lots of close-ups of cows' udders, which obviously the children find hilarious, because once again Charles Dance has been given the wrong film by whatever company or stock library sends him these things. So he gets on the phone and complains and kind of blusters about how someone should really lose their job over this because they keep doing it to him. Well, twice. So that person is Cassie Stewart, again an actor I'm not really that familiar with. She did some stuff in the 80s and early 90s, and she ends up losing her job, and then he's kind of walking through the streets of London and she accosts him and tears his jacket, not in a violent way, just as a can I have your attention kind of way, and you owe me a cup of coffee or you owe me your time because you got me fired. And she's desperate to have something to show Charles Dance, which he's obviously not very impressed about, but eventually she gets him to one of her previous employers. She's had quite a lot of previous employers, which is a company run by Richard E. Grant. Well, this is just a couple of years after Withnail and I, and he's wearing blue spectacles, you can see in one of the images here, and he's just basically playing Richard E. Grant. But he kind of runs not sure what it's, a visual arts company or whatever, and there's actually a little subplot or something. There's a scene with him and Charles Dance about the fact that Richard E. Grant has VHSs, yes, we're in the VHS world, of his own dreams, and he's got a VHS of one of Charles Dance's dreams, one of his recurring dreams, and it's like, this is after a party or during a party, so you don't know whether it's actually real or not. But again, that's a nice little sideline that's never kind of brought back, because again, as I said, this film is a little flawed, so it has interesting ideas dispersed, but it never really coalesces completely, which again, there is as I said, there's a Shaggy Dog kind of charm to it, but I can see it might frustrate some people as well. It's almost, completely different tonally, but it has that kind of Big Lebowski sort of ramshackle Shaggy Dog all over the place kind of narrative, if you will. But the thing that Cassie Stewart's character desperately wants to show Charles Dance is an old film where it looks like a woman is being abducted from the streets in the 40s, and the mismatched pair then kind of go around the hidden parts of London, the tunnels underneath. And again, this is one of the reasons why the release is kind of a fascinating one, and one that I would kind of recommend, even though, as I said, the film might not be to everybody's tastes. It's these huge underground tunnels full of old film and old paperwork and old government stuff. It's just fascinating, because again, as with anybody who lives anywhere, sometimes seeing the city you live in 35 years ago and how it looks now is sometimes quite fascinating. So they go through back doors and under the city to find, and each film has another snippet and another film, and eventually, hopefully things piece together, the strange characters and people that hassle the pair, try and get whatever the pair have accidentally found. There's a mix of English actors and Scottish actors, obviously Bill Patterson, but there's another couple that you'll recognise their faces. There's scenes on rubbish tips. Again, it's this idea of all the history and all this information that's just thrown out, lying in derelict warehouses or under the city itself, which is kind of fascinating. And again, it's about hiding information in like the public information films, hoping that somebody might find it like years later and piece it together. So again, it's something about filmmaking, it's something about archiving, and it's also something about the history of a city and its people. But again, it's almost that Hal Hartley called his film Amateur an action film with flat tire. So Hidden City is kind of like a thriller with a flat tire. There's a large sequence. It turns out Cassie Stewart has a young daughter, so there's a whole section of the film where Charles Dance gets dumped with this young girl, so he's kind of moving about parts of London with this young girl attached, which his ex-wife is like, where did you find her? For this kind of mismatched pair, the film does the nice thing of there's no romance between them. I mean, Charles Dance might quite like it, but then he would still quite like to get back to his ex-wife. So it doesn't have that Hollywood romanticism about it, because I'm sure if this was like remade in Hollywood or made in Hollywood, you know, the two of them would get together. But I like the fact that they don't, and it's Cassie Stewart who's like, you know, we're friends and it's not going to go any further. You know, initially Charles Dance thinks she's like 17 or 18 and it turns out she's like 25, you know, well over the hill. So I like that, the fact that it doesn't become romantic as so many of these films it would turn romantic, and the fact that Charles Dance has kind of got this kid for a large section of the film while he's being essentially chased through London, which is quite funny, and again has that same kind of Shaggy Dog feel. You know, this isn't a Hollywood blockbuster thriller, you know, with Will Smith or something like that. This is very much British, very much 80s, and it is all the more charming for it, even as I say, it's far from, you know, a flawless film or a perfect film. There are kind of flashbacks, or, you know, we see the parts of the film from the 40s in other films, but then we also see it full screen as kind of flashbacks that only the audience is seeing in kind of full screen. It's what characters are imagining. So there is a kind of playfulness about the film as well, as we see the past kind of crashing up against the reality. Again, in the 80s there were kind of films like Hidden City and Hidden Agenda, which was more based in Ireland, but Defence of the Realm with Gabriel Byrne and Greta Scacchi as well, and it has that kind of flavour to it. But as I said, this is more fractured and not quite, you know, narratively smooth. But I mean, it's engaging enough because, again, Charles Dance is fantastic. We even get a flashback to his school days. He's a statistician and writer. He's very kind of self-important, but again, he's not to the extent of being like really unlikable. But again, as I said, this kind of video and review is more about the whole package. So as usual, with BFI, there's some really interesting extras which again add to the release and give it more perspective and more kind of interest. So there's a commentary with writer and director Stephen Polikoff and film critic Michael Brook. But there's a series of treasures from the BFI National Archive, because again the film itself is about archival films and stuff that is just left in vaults and never discovered. So this is from 1903 to 1947. It's 58 minutes worth, but it's fascinating. So you have Cheese Mites from 1903, Barging Through London from 1924, Hop Gardens of Kent, which is actually one of the films that is in the narrative film, from 1933, The City from 1939, Shown by Request from 1947, and there's a little 1 minute piece from 2023 inside the BFI National Archive. I'm sure that could have been longer, but that's a minute long. So the feature itself is 108 minutes, as very much like a barge going through canals that kind of meanders its way. But there's 58 minutes of fascinating archival films. So as I said, I mean, I got this in the recent BFI sale, It's usually about £17 and I got it for 12. But I'm sure if you wait, eventually this will come down. I picked up Eternal Daughter with Tilda Swinton, HMV, had that in the 2 for 15. So I mean, eventually this will appear maybe in 2 for 15. I do like to support BFI, but sometimes their sales are like £1 off or whatever. But their most recent sale, you were actually getting decent chunks off relatively new releases. So again, it's not a film I would say, or a release that I would say go out and buy at full price, but certainly if you can get it a bit cheaper and you're into seeing the architecture of cities and how many buildings, if you live in London especially, how many buildings that are featured in this film aren't there anymore, and obviously that underneath all the hidden little nooks and crannies of cities, it's kind of fascinating. So that's a fairly random, rambling review of Hidden City and the extras. Again, not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but well worth a look, and well worth a wiggle. And again, it's great to see Charles Dance not in just a supporting role, but actually a lead role. So thanks very much for watching. Let me know if you've seen Hidden City and what you think of it, and hopefully join me again for more videos. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.